to take very seriously the brief, the instructions that Professor Tamer sent us. And we hope we've covered all the points that he laid down in his brief to us. But they will not always be very obvious where those individual points are, but they should be there. So it's only a sketch, and what we were struggling to do was to try and find the shape of the paper, the shape of the argument that we wanted to present in the paper. So, protology in Judaism is synonymous with the idea of creation. The belief that the universe, heaven and earth, things material and spiritual, seen and unseen, are the work of a single all-powerful deity. The universe depends on him and could not exist without his will and agency. But he does not depend on the universe, and he exists in self-sufficiency apart from it. Creation was an act of divine will. God chose to create the universe. It is not the result of an accident or the operation of impersonal forces, and it continues to exist because he constantly holds it in being. God brought the universe into existence to serve his own purpose, and that purpose, because he is all-powerful, will, despite apparent setbacks, in the end be achieved. Its achievement is the subject of eschatology, and the process by which it is achieved is the subject of soteriology. Protology, soteriology, and eschatology dovetail into a single powerful myth of the origins, purpose, and end of all things. The doctrine of creation in Judaism is laid down in the founding document of Judaism, its holy writings, the Tanakh, or Hebrew Bible. That the God of Israel made the heavens and earth is presupposed throughout the Tanakh, but how he did this is discursively expounded in only one place, the opening 3 chapters of the Torah, the first and most authoritative section of the ancient Hebrew canon of Scripture. The importance of these chapters for protology in Judaism cannot be overemphasized. All subsequent discussion of the subject within Judaism circles around them and attempts to justify its claims from them, and our account of protology in Judaism will be presented basically in terms of the reception of Genesis 1 to 3. It has long been recognized by Jewish commentators, at least since the Middle Ages, that Genesis 1 to 3 in effect contains 2 accounts of creation. First, 1:1 to 2:3, the work of the 6 days, culminating the creation of humankind and the inauguration of Shabbat. And 2:4 to 3:24, the setting of the first parents in the Garden of Eden, their disobedience, punishment, and expulsion from the garden. These 2 stories are very different, and modern scholarship assigns them to different sources. But they are not incompatible, and they were harmonized together in the tradition and treated as one. We will begin by analyzing this story, noting its plain sense, what's called in Judaism its pshat, in order to provide a baseline from which to measure the subsequent development of the tradition. So taken together, Genesis 1 to 3 offers a comprehensive account of the origins of various elements of the world as we know it. It explains the origins of the material world. It was created by God. But the natural understanding of the Hebrew syntax of Genesis 1:1 to 3 is that it was created out of pre-existing chaotic matter. Creation was the imposing of order on chaos. 2, it explains the origins of time. Time is ordered time, and so time came into existence only with the ordering of the world. Chaotic, undifferentiated time, which characterized the primeval chaos, does not really count as time. Time is measured by the movement of the sun and the moon, which demarcate day and night, and the seasons. The most significant division of time is marked by every 7th day, the Shabbat, being set aside as holy. The setting aside of the 7th day is a divine command, not something dictated by the natural motion of the sun or the moon. 3, it explains the origins of living beings. It distinguishes between animate and inanimate nature. Animate nature is characterized by fixity of species. Plants and animals reproduce after their kind. Within animate nature, humankind is a special creation, distinct from plants and animals, and this is signaled in a number of ways. The human body is directly formed by God, and the soul is directly breathed into it by God. Humanity was created gendered for the purpose of procreation, but the female was created subordinate to the male. From this primal pair, the whole of humanity is descended. 4, it explains the origins of evil. This entered into the world through the disobedience of the primal pair and resulted in the cursing of the ground, pain and suffering, the expulsion of the primal pair from the garden, and the denial to them of immortality. And finally, it sets out the structure of the cosmos. Genesis 1-3 presupposes a 2-decker universe, the heavens above and the earth beneath. The standard view in early Judaism, or in biblical religion, which is hinted at in Genesis 1-3, is that the heavens are the abode of God and certain spirits, and there may be multiple heavens piled one on top of another. The earth beneath is the abode of humans, animals, and plants. Elsewhere, Jewish cosmology developed the idea of an underworld deep within the earth, which is the abode of the dead. This, in effect, turned the universe into a 3-decker world: the heavens above, the earth below, and the underworld, Sheol, beneath it. So that's a sort of sketch of a plain reading of the biblical story in Genesis 1-3. And that will be our kind of baseline from which we move forward and look at the reception of that story subsequently in Judaism. The key Jewish myth of the origin of all things is short and elusive and raises many questions. It was read in different ways within the later tradition, as later interpreters struggled to understand it, fill in the gaps, and reconcile it with the world as they knew it and the state of knowledge of their own day. This reception history can be divided into 3 broad periods. 1, Antiquity, stretching from the editing of Genesis 1-3, say in the 5th century BCE, down to roughly the rise of Islam in the 7th century CE. 2, the Middle Ages, from the rise of Islam down to the Renaissance, 7th to 15th centuries. And 3, modernity, from the Renaissance down to the present day. So first then, Antiquity. This is the period when Judaism, as we know it today, first emerged. And the myth of origins in Genesis 1-3 became central to its religious worldview. The reception of it in the later biblical books, the Apocrypha, the Pseudepigrapha, the Rabbinic Midrashim, and the Talmuds, is rich and diverse. 3 strands of interpretation can be detected: the Midrashic, the philosophical, and the Proto-Scientific. Midrash is the tradition of Bible interpretation which emerged within Rabbinic Judaism the form of Judaism which has remained normative down to the present day. Midrash has had an enormous influence because it is regarded as part of the oral Torah, the authoritative interpretation of the written Torah. Its approach can be classified as mythical because it basically extends the myth of Genesis 1 to 3 by filling in narratively the gaps in the Genesis story. It will take the lion's share of our attention in our coverage of this period, but it is worth noting briefly here the emergence of two other approaches because they are harbingers of things to come. The philosophical approach is well represented by Philo of Alexandria. In his De Opificio Mundi and other writings, he offered a reading of Genesis 1 to 3 in terms of the doctrine of creation in Plato's Timaeus. A product of Hellenistic Judaism who wrote in Greek, Philo had enormous influence on the development of Christian protology, but was unknown to later Judaism till modern times. So we're not going to spend much time on it. That's as much as we're going to say, because he was unknown to later Judaism. Nevertheless, his attempts to reconcile Genesis with philosophy anticipate the emergence of a philosophical approach within mainstream rabbinic Judaism in the Middle Ages, on which we will have more to say presently. And then the other approach which begins to emerge in this period is what we call the Proto-Scientific approach. In Antiquity, this is represented by two contrasting works in Hebrew, the Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Formation, which may go back to the 4th century, and the Seder Rabbah Divrei Shit, the Great Order of Creation, which may be from the 7th century. The full flowering of the scientific approach only emerged in Judaism in the modern period. Now, for the sake of time, you have the text here. I won't expound even briefly here the Sefer Yetzirah and the Sefer Rabbah Divrei Shit. Let me come to the Midrashic approach, which is the one that we really have to focus on in this period. This can be classified as mythopoeic, as a mythopoeic extension of the Genesis story. It is represented by two influential Midrashim, Bereshit Rabbah of the 5th and Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer of the 8th century. These had a profound influence on the Jewish imagination. The Midrash is driven by the urge to solve the puzzles and fill the gaps in the Genesis myth. One obvious gap is that Genesis does not account clearly for the origin of spirits. In the world of the Midrash, these were of various kinds. There were angels, powerful sentient beings, intermediary between God and humanity, who under God play a significant role as his agents in the world. There is a fleeting reference to them in Genesis 3:24 and possibly Genesis 1:26. But when they were created is not stated. Midrash affirmed that it was on the 3rd day. Another kind of spirit were demons, again sentient beings distinct from angels, who were seen as causing harm to humanity, such as illness. Their origins are even less evident in the creation story than the angels. Yet it was deemed equally important that they too should owe their existence, despite the fact that they are a source of evil in the world, to God and be subject to his authority. Exorcism and protection against demons, which was widely practiced in Jewish magic, relied upon the fact that they were subordinate to God's power. The Midrash asserted that demons too originated on the 3rd day. One particular demon, a female demon called Lilith, was inserted by the Midrash into the Genesis myth as Adam's first demonic wife, who was later supplanted by Eve, and who, out of jealousy, spent her time attacking women in childbirth. As you can imagine, and we will draw reference to this in our article, modern Jewish feminists have had a field day with this extension of the biblical myth. A final spirit, the origins of which are clarified in Midrash, is the human soul, a type of spirit different from demons and angels. Genesis 2:7 propounds a dualistic body-soul anthropology. The soul is breathed into the material body by God, but where does it come from? Is it part of the divine essence? The Midrash asserts that it too was created on the third day. Some Midrashim developed the idea that all human souls were created on the third day and stored in a storehouse of souls in heaven, till the appointed time when they would be incarnated on earth. Some even developed a sort of doctrine of reincarnation. The pre-existence of the soul paved the way for the doctrine of the post-mortem existence of the soul, which of course became a cardinal doctrine of Judaism. Another area where Midrash extended the Genesis myth was in the story of the temptation and fall of the first parents. The serpent who tempted Eve was seen as an agent of fallen angels, and in particular of the chief of the fallen angels, Samael, who was identified with Satan or the devil. The power of this myth over the Western imagination can hardly be overestimated. It is here that the mythopoeic power of the Midrashic imagination reaches its apogee. The Midrash also clarifies the relationship of the Torah to creation. It claims that it pre-existed the creation and actually formed the blueprint according to which God made the world. It was one of the 7 things created before the creation of the world. It represented the divine ideal for the world. This has a payoff in the moral sphere. Whoever keeps the Torah is not only following God's commandments, but living in accordance with the laws of nature and the telos of creation. Given the richness and diversity of Midrashic reflection in Genesis 1-3, it comes as a surprise that there was an attempt by the rabbinic authorities to suppress such speculation. This clearly did not have much effect, but it had some, and it can be seen throughout the Midrashim in their attempts to deflect attention from cosmogonic and cosmological issues to more moralizing and homiletic ones. As, for example, in the story of the diminution of the light of the moon as a punishment for its straying into the sun's domain. Another diversionary tactic is the constant attempt to integrate eschatology and protology by seeing anticipations of the Endzeit in the Urzeit. An example of this is the myth of God's killing of Leviathan's mate and preserving her as food for the messianic banquet at the end of time. Again, it is hard to imagine a more mythopoeic extension of the Genesis story. So that's a sketch of Midrash in late antiquity. We are focusing on Midrash because it has had an enormous influence on the Jewish imagination on the theme of protology. Now the Middle Ages. The biblical myth of the origins of the world with its rich Midrashic elaborations remained central to Jewish protology in the Middle Ages. A new style of Bible commentary known as Parshanut, as distinct from Midrash, emerged, and it evinced a new hermeneutical approach to the biblical text dominated by philology. This is exemplified, for example, by Ibn Ezra and Kimchi, and to a certain extent by Rashi, though he was drawn to the more sober Midrash, which was close to the plain sense of scripture. Parshanut occasionally attempts to integrate the scientific knowledge of its day into its commentary. It anticipates in some respects the historical critical approach to scripture of the modern period. More important for our present purposes is the philosophical revolution. This was to transform Jewish belief. It begins in mainstream rabbinic Judaism in the 9th century in response to the Arabic Kalam, which in turn was a response to the translation of Greek philosophical writings into Arabic. These rendered the mythic statements of the traditional worldview unacceptable to Jewish intellectuals, and they set out to restate their traditional beliefs in ways that would be philosophically defensible. Key figures in the development of a philosophical protology in Judaism were Saadia Gaon, Isaac Israeli, Shlomo ibn Gabirol, Moses Maimonides, Levi ben Gershom, and Hasdai Crescas. These took up subtly nuanced positions, but were united in their aim to elucidate scripture from philosophy and to state scripture's teachings in ways that were compatible with philosophy. They took on the whole a rather sanguine view of the relationship of reason and revelation. Saadia was the most sanguine of all and saw no conflict at all between the two. The faculty of reason was God-given, and if used correctly, would always reach the same conclusions as revelation. Maimonides was more skeptical, more conscious of the limitations of reason, particularly on questions like the origin of the world. Those limitations, he argued, opened spaces that at the present could only be filled by revelation. There were two main philosophical views as to the origin of things with which the Jewish thinkers were confronted, one identified basically as Aristotelian, in quotes, and the other as Platonic, in quotes. The strict accuracy of these labels is, of course, questionable, but they are widely used and will serve our purpose here. In both views, the world depends on a first cause who can be identified with God. But God is a pure essence who is utterly different from the world. He is wholly other and can only be described in apophatic terms by the negation of the attributes of worldly existence. This generated problems. If the first cause is pure essence, without body parts or passions, how can it be the cause of a diverse and changing world? If it is a pure spirit, how can it be the cause of matter? The philosophical views tended to deny that God had brought matter into being. The Aristotelian view postulated that matter was co-eternal with God, though it stood nonetheless in a relationship of dependence on him. The implication of this is that the creation did not take place in time. Time stretches back from the present eternally. The Platonic view held that the world did come into being in time, but that God made it out of pre-existent matter. Platonism, especially in its Neoplatonic variety, tried to bridge the gap between God and the world through a series of intermediary intelligences, to soften, so to speak, the abruptness of the transition. It adopted a theory of emanation. The world flowed out of God, and the further one got from the source of the flow, the more impure, so to speak, the flow became, till finally we reach matter. This model has certain implications. It led to a negative view of matter. Salvation for the soul was to escape from its material existence and reascend up the chain of being to its source. And it had no place for a doctrine of divine will. The world emerged of necessity from God. Now, the Jewish philosophers fully recognized that these ideas were hard to reconcile with tradition. But when there was a conflict with philosophy, by and large, they did not hesitate to assert the biblical view, to defend it with philosophical argument, and to attack on philosophical grounds the coherence of the philosophical position. Some, for example, Gersonides and Maimonides to a limited degree, were prepared to entertain the possibility of the eternity of matter. But others, Saadia, Israeli, and Ibn Gabirol, espoused in various forms a doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, a view which carried less dangers for the sort of theism that they espoused. The ontological gap that was thus postulated between God and the world was bridged by the divine will. That the world exists is down to God's free choice. Moreover, the divine will permeates the whole of the world, which is kept in being constantly by the exercise of that will. This chimes with the biblical depiction of God as the active, moral governor of the world. Both Israeli and Ibn Gabirol took this line, despite the fact that they were influenced in many ways by Neoplatonism. And some Jewish thinkers found it difficult, in the light of Genesis 1, to see matter as negative. The most thorough rejection of this was by Ibn Gabirol, who adopted a radical hylomorphism, which placed pure matter and pure form as the first things created by God, the two combining to form the primal intellect. This completely sets Neoplatonism on its head, and Ibn Gabirol presumably did this because he wanted to remain faithful to the biblical revelation as he understood it. Now, for the sake of time, I have a longish section here on the mystical approach, which I will not cover. It's here. It's very important. We will cover it in the actual article, looking at the Zohar's cosmology and the modification, the very powerful modification of that by 16th century Safavian Kabbalah with its doctrine of the contraction of God, Tzimtzum, a kind of divine kenosis. Now modernity. The Midrashic homiletic and philosophical approaches to Genesis 1 to 3 have continued to be expounded in Judaism in the modern period, but Jewish protological thinking has been stimulated in particular by two developments. First, advances in science, and second, the emergence of ideological criticism of the Bible. Jews have played a central role in the development of modern science out of all proportion to their numbers. And this has meant that they have been well placed to understand the potential challenges that science poses to biblical protology. This challenge posed by the challenge posed by Darwinian evolution was particularly acute. Among the key issues it raised were the age of the world, whether unimaginable eons have elapsed, or the 6,000 years of biblical chronology, whether life forms have changed over time and evolved into one another, or remained static from the moment of creation after their kind, as the Bible claims. How the claim that humankind reflected the image of God sat with humanity's alleged animal origins, and whether the roots of morality lay in the Garden of Eden or were also an evolved phenomenon. Despite the manifest problems, early Jewish responses to Darwinian evolutionary theory were relatively relaxed, often self-consciously setting themselves against what they regarded as Christian hysteria. The tone was set by the British Chief Rabbi Nathan Adler, who insisted that Judaism has nothing to fear from the advancement of science, but everything to gain. Samson Raphael Hirsch, another very important early modern thinker, maintained that there was nothing inherently problematic for Judaism in allowing that God had created life through the natural law of evolution, bringing forth order from apparent chaos. And we'll also look at Naphtali Levi, who translated The Origins of Species into Hebrew in 1874, and again, who felt that there was no real problem, no real conflict between the traditional Jewish biblical story of creation and the new science. We'll also look, I'm conscious of the time here, we'll also look at Elijah ben Amozeg, another modern thinker Jewish thinker who dealt with evolution. And with a very important figure, Abraham Isaac Kook, the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi, and one of the best known Jewish religious authorities to engage positively with evolution. Abraham Isaac Kook tried to draw some parallels between the medieval Kabbalah and modern evolution, and seeing the Kabbalah as being an anticipation in some ways of evolutionary theory. And that has remained a very popular line in Judaism right down to the present day. From the early 19th century, a variety of progressive forms of Judaism had emerged in Europe and the United States, which found evolutionary ideas rather congenial. Characteristic of the general movement was a conviction that religion had evolved over time and a determination to reconcile Judaism with the best of modern philosophical and scientific thought. By the end of the 19th century, this Reform Judaism was the dominant form of Judaism in North America. While there was little interest in the apparent cruelty, competition, and chance of Darwinism proper, there was a great interest in various theistic, progressive, and teleological conceptions of evolutionary theory, which viewed organic evolution as a natural law and the means by which God achieved his purposes. There also emerged a profound tendency towards panentheism, something that had already been hinted at in the more orthodox work of Levi, the translator of Darwin into Hebrew. Influential attempts to reconcile Genesis and evolution were put forward by the father of modern Reform Judaism, Isaac Mayer Wise, and by Kaufmann Kohler, who was a very important Reform theologian. We trace that a little bit further right down to modern times, and that section concludes with the comment: the case of the scientific approach to the question of origins demonstrates historically strong desire among Jews, both progressives and traditionalists, to align with the mainstream scientific evolutionary worldview wherever possible, often by drawing upon deep hermeneutical resources that could justify theistic concepts of evolution. Occasionally, the attempt to do so led to unfamiliar ways of defining God's relation to nature and to natural laws by weaving the divine into the workings of the natural world, or by emphasizing divine immanence to a degree that some find disconcerting and suspicious. And then we'll have a section on which is labeled Judaic Protology and Ideological Criticism of the Bible. By ideological criticism, we mean that approach to the Bible, which is not so much interested in the historical meaning of the text in its historical setting, as in the uses to which the text has been put, and the impact for good or ill that it has had on history and society. And there are two areas of ideological criticism of traditional Jewish protology which have flourished in recent years. One is feminism, which has radically reread the Genesis story, Jewish feminism. And the other is a burgeoning area of ecological criticism, which is concerned that the command in Genesis to humanity to subdue the earth has had a very baleful effect ecologically on our attitude to the earth. Okay, quickly coming to an end. We're going to have a section on protology and hermeneutics. Throughout the development of Judaic protology, how Genesis 1 to 3 was read was heavily determined by the hermeneutical stance adopted by the reader. We cannot understand the various points of view without understanding the hermeneutics which lies behind them. Thus, Saadia, in principle, saw no conflict between revelation and reason, because he held that human reason was a gift from God. Maimonides, however, was more conscious of the limits of reason, more ready to concede that there are certain truths reason would never have discovered off its own bat, truths of revelation which could never be proved by reason, and his reading of Genesis 1-3 was affected accordingly. Contemporary readings of the same chapters cannot ignore the modern academic analysis to which they have been subjected. This has been dominated by the historical critical approach. A vast quantity of critical scholarship on Genesis 1-3 has accumulated, to which Christian and latterly Jewish scholars have contributed. There is much scholarly disagreement as to the detail, but most scholars concur on some basic points that challenge the tradition. So the vast majority agree that Moses did not write the Pentateuch, and that the ancient Near East and the ancient Near Eastern parallels to the biblical creation myth have had the effect of relativizing the biblical accounts and showing that they are to some degree dependent on ancient Near Eastern sources and very much of their time and place. This problematizes the traditional view that they are divine revelation directly from God. The responses to modern critical scholarship within Judaism have been diverse. Some simply reject it as incorrect. A few even try to construct academic arguments to refute it. Others accept its basic findings and revise their doctrines of Scripture accordingly. A common conclusion is that modern critical scholarship has removed some of the pressure to accept Genesis 1-3 as literal fact, and this makes it easier to reconcile Genesis and science. The relationship between critical scholarship and Judaism continues to evolve. The conflict between scholarship and tradition has eased a little in recent decades. Some of the extreme claims made in the first flush of the discovery of the Babylonian creation myths have been moderated by the realization that the Bible, though using motifs from contemporary culture, is often telling its own profoundly distinctive story. And scholarship within the academy has been subjected to postmodernist critique, which has chastened the overconfidence of modernism and opened up again the possibility of asserting the value, indeed the truth, of narratives that are not literally true. But postmodernism does not put the clock back to pre-modernism, and the basic challenge of academic critical scholarship to the religious tradition remains and will need to be addressed. We then have a section on parallels with Christianity and Islam, and the final section is the future of protology in Judaism. Judaism today is highly diverse and runs the whole gamut from the secular at one end of the spectrum, that is Jews who identify as Jews basically for cultural or social reasons and who may be agnostic or even atheistic, to the ultra-Orthodox at the other, that is Jews who accept that the Torah is from heaven and was given to Moses by God at Sinai as an unchanging rule of faith and practice. Though, as noted, each of the varieties of Judaism will apply different hermeneutical assumptions to the creation story, all will tend to see it, if interpreted in the right way, as continuing to have things of value to say in our present contemporary world. How exactly they claim this support will depend, as indicated, on prior hermeneutical assumptions linked to their view of the nature of Scripture, whether it is wisdom from the past, which carries strong cultural cachet, but has to be supported on other empirical or moral grounds, or is divine revelation, so has superordinate authority. It would be hard to find contemporary Jewish thinkers, whatever their hermeneutics, who would want to totally discard Genesis 1-3. The unavoidable fact is that the creation story is an integral part of the central myth of Judaism, that the world was created by God, that God's world has been marred by human sin, and it is in need of mending, that the people of Israel were chosen by God to play a key role in the mending of the world, that mending will one day be achieved and God's original purpose in creation finally realized. Some will hold to this myth with greater literalness than others, but the vast majority will try to maintain the basic narrative in some shape or form. The history of Protology and Judaism, which we have sketched, gives grounds for concluding that the core myth is sufficiently adaptable, the accumulated tradition sufficiently rich, and the hermeneutical resources sufficiently developed as to enable Judaism to meet any future intellectual challenges that will confront it. This basic narrative, as we saw, shared with Christianity, has become a primal myth of Western civilization, reflected in its art, its literature, its philosophy, and its politics. Even in post-Christian societies, its outlines remain widely known, and so can be a ready point of cultural reference in discussing society's problems. The creation element of that myth will undoubtedly undergo transformation and restatement in the future, as it has in the past. But it is hard to see it disappearing entirely. If it does, then Judaism as a worldview and a system of belief will be altered beyond recognition. Thank you.